Hey guys and girls, welcome back to another beautiful video on this beautiful channel, on this beautiful day. How you guys and girls doing? Hope you're doing great as always. Please check out the description box for all the nice links. Also drop a like, subscribe if you like the content. So here we are, we're back. The first step for today is going to be to make sure we have our mouse position we were talking about in the last video and have that saved. So like I said, there were three different types of mouse positions. There was a screen mouse position and there was a window mouse position. Now in the future, we're going to make it a little more complex. We're going to have a view mouse position as well. But for this video, all I'm going to save is, oh, what am I doing? Mouse positions. And I'm just going to save the mouse position for the window, okay? Relative within the window. So not the whole screen, just a little window that we have. For that, you're going to need a vector2i, since that's what this mouse position is. So it's holding two integers, x and y, basically. It's very simple. Mouse, and I usually call it mouse pos window, okay? So we're going to have this variable here. And then what we're going to do is, since we're keeping everything divided up like this, I'm going to keep poll events there. I'm going to actually do a void update mouse positions. Okay. And now we're only going to have one mouse position, but it's a good habit to get into when you're developing a game to make functions like this, because you never know in the future if you're going to add more mouse positions, if you're going to add more things. You have it separated in different functions, all commented out and nice. So this one we can comment if you want. You can just add a little simple comment to it. You can say that it's a void return void. You can explain it if you want. You can say updates the mouse positions. It updates the window mouse position relative to window, and you can say, okay, it's a vector 2i. You can go as complex as you want in here. I'm just gonna keep it like this, maybe make it a little cleaner. Just do that. Okay, usually you probably want it like this as well, something like that. Anyway, that's a comment, and all you want to do in this function is you want to say this mouse position window mouse pos window equals this sf mouse, like we did in the last video, get position this window. Okay, and that's what you want to do. You want to dereference the window because this takes a reference to a window, not a pointer, and our window here is a pointer. Okay, so you want to dereference that so it goes in as a reference. And once that's done, we're good. Now we need to call this function. Don't forget to call it. As soon as you make a new function like this, you should actually just go in, put it in before you even start coding it. Just go ahead and put it in here. So I'm going to have poll events first, and then I'm going to say this update mouse positions, and hopefully you can see what's going on. I'm going to remove the old one. And hopefully you can see, like I said, what's going on, because we have these functions. And when you look at update, you're like, what's going on? What am I updating? In what order am I updating things? You don't have a million lines of code here. You just have a few functions that are separated nicely. You can see, okay, poll events is before update mouse. Okay, if there's an error, I can switch those places instead of having to copy all this code and switch its place, right? So that's why it's good to keep everything separated. The same thing with drawing and rendering, especially here, because the order you render things is very important. If I render my enemy above something else, the enemy is going to block it, obviously. And if I do it the other way around, you know, there's going to be a problem. So a good example of that is when you're rendering your UI, you want it to be in front of everything else. So you probably want to render that last, just so it's right in front of everything. So usually it's a good thing to think about that. Good. We can do the same little thing here. I don't know, whatever you want to do. Okay, so our next step is going to be to create enemies and store enemies. Okay, there's several ways you can do this. You can create your own custom container, but we're going to use vector. because I like vector and it's nice. It makes the stuff simple. Can push things back and everything, especially for tutorials. So if you're a hardcore C++ person and you all want to make dynamic memory, everything, this isn't really the tutorial for that. This is just to keep it simple, just so you guys know what's going on, okay? So try to bear with me with these fixes. So it's not an SF actually, it's an std vector, and it's going to contain SF rectangle shapes and call it enemies, okay? Very simple. So it's just like that. We're going to have an enemy here, and that's going to be good. Okay, so once you have that ready, we're going to go ahead into our game here. Here, init enemies, yeah. So we already have a function called init enemies. So it initializes our enemy. It sets its position, does all that stuff. What you want to do now is, in our case, if you're making a game, in the next coming games, we're going to make classes for an enemy. That's usually what you want to do. Otherwise, you're going to have to do what I'm going to do in this video, where we keep it simple, but it's going to be a little more code, because we're going to change the position every time we spawn an enemy, and we're going to change the color of that enemy, okay? And sometimes you don't even make more enemies in a list or a vector like this. You just have one enemy object, and you kind of just print it out in different positions. But we're going to have several enemy objects because we have RAM, we have memory. We can play around with that if we want. So that's good. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another function in update here, functions. Okay. And we're going to define that, define that function like this. And all this is going to do is going to help us spawn our enemies, okay? And then, where did I put it? Right here. Okay, so it's going to help us spawn our enemies, meaning we're going to get some enemies on the screen. But before we do that, let's just set everything, what do you call it? Just set up everything, basically. So I want to do a render, for example, for our enemies, all right? And I want to do an update for our enemies. And how do we do that? Do we do everything in code in these functions, or do we create their own functions? So usually what I do is I make a function for update for the enemies, and I make a function for rendering of the enemies. So void render enemies. All right, and this might seem tedious because we're making several functions, but it's actually a good thing, because then you can customize how you render your enemies while not clogging up these main functions that we have for rendering and updating. So now we have our beautiful functions. Like I said, before we even get started, let's go ahead and render all our enemies. So this, render enemies, that's all we have to do, okay? And then we're gonna say this update enemies. Oh no, sorry, it was in itself. It should be right there, update enemies, okay? So you have these functions calling now. Now all you have to do is define these and say what's gonna happen. Well, what's going to happen in my update enemies? Here's where I'm going to spawn my enemies. Here's where I'm going to change their position when I spawn them, and all that stuff, right? And to do that, we need some game logic. And here we have a lot of game objects and stuff. We need some game logic. So I'm going to make a little thing here. What you can do as well is keep everything organized by like enemy stuff. So enemy stuff would be around enemy and stuff like that. But for this case, I don't have a lot of code. So I'm going to put everything in a game logic kind of comment below it. So what we need is we need a timer, float enemy spawn timer. And I'm going to keep my names long because it should be explanatory, right? Kind of self-explanatory. So if you see it, you don't get confused. Then we're going to have float enemy spawn timer max. Okay, so obviously we want a max, and then we want a int saying, you could use it unsigned if you're going hardcore, but we're just gonna use an int, call it max enemies, and it's gonna be a maximum amount of enemies on the screen at one time, and our vector is gonna keep track of how many enemies there are right now. Okay, and we might just make something above here called int points, just like that, okay? And that's good, that's good. We'll just keep it like that for now. Now, if you remember, in the last videos, we had a function called init variables. And we're going to use that now even more. And we're going to initialize the game logic. So what did we create? We created a few variables. I'm just going to copy these so I don't forget. It's a good thing. Put it right there. We don't need to care about all this. I'm just going to copy paste. So we had points, and we're going to set points to 0. We have float enemies. No. This enemy spawn timer, and we're going to set it to 0.f. This enemy spawn timer max is going to be set to, since we're not using any delta time stuff, basically things that control how fast our timers are depending on our frame rate, I really recommend you to have the same frame rate as I am. We could even change this to 60 actually. So whatever you do, just keep it at 60. Make sure your computer can run this at 60 FPS, and we'll have the same effect and the same amount of distance, and the timers are going to go the same speed because we're running it at the same frames. Okay, so make sure you do that. Then our timers are all going to sync together. So once you have that done, let's set the timer to how fast do we want our enemies to spawn? 1000F, something like that. We can use a real clock timer in another video, but we're just going to use float, simple float timers. This max enemies equals, let's say we have a maximum enemies of maybe 5 is better, just 5, something like that. You can remove this now. So now we have initialized stuff. If you want your enemy to spawn directly, we can do this. We can have spawn timer max first, and get the hell out of here. Okay, and then we can do this enemy spawn timer. So the timer is going to start at its max value and then just be reset to 0. Okay, once that's done, let's go ahead and create a function for the timer. No, actually, we'll just use the enemy thing. Doesn't matter. So we have everything here. Everything related to enemy will happen in here. This is for spawning the enemy, and this is the updating enemy. So here we go. Let's just go ahead and do this. This, if this, so we're gonna update the time now. Spawn timer is greater or equal to this enemy spawn timer max. So if it's at the same thing, we're gonna say this enemy spawn timer equals 0.f. Okay, so we're gonna reset it, and else this enemy spawn timer plus plus, or that's not a good thing, plus equals 0.f, 1.f. Okay, so we're increasing enemy spawn timer on while it's less than enemy spawn timer max, basically. All right, and the whole thing is going to be if this max enemies, or let's check this out, if this enemies dot size is less than this max enemies. So while we're less than how many enemies we're supposed to have, we're going to keep going. And once the timer ends, which is in this if statement, we're going to spawn an enemy. So this spawn enemy. Okay, very simple, right? Very, very simple. And this is updating the timer for enemy spawning. And then spawn the enemy and reset the timer. All right. And to comment on this, what you can write is just very simply at return void, something like that. Updates the enemy spawn timer and spawns enemies when the total enemies is smaller x something like that. Whatever you want to do, just go ahead and do that. And we do call update enemies in here, so that's good. It's going to be calling this. All we need to do now is actually define spawn enemies. So to spawn an enemy, what do we do? Well, to spawn an enemy, first of all, we're going to spawns enemies and sets their color and positions. Colors and positions. Okay, good. Sets a random position, sets a random color, spawns, adds enemy to the vector. Simple. So that's the steps we're gonna do. Okay, to get a random number, what we're going to do is we're gonna include ctime like that. And that is so we can initialize our random. This is initializing our seed for our random numbers. So basically, it will enable us to get random numbers. If you watch C++ tutorials, you will understand. srand time null. And time is a time t, and this takes an unsigned. So what you want to do is static cast unsigned like that, so you don't get any warnings, and you're good. So that's what you want to do. You could write std in front of that. I think, yeah. So that is initializing our srand. Now we're going to use that. And to use that, what you want to do, also this isn't done yet, the update enemies isn't done yet. We're going to have to moves the enemies downwards. Okay, so there you go. It spawns the enemies and moves the enemies. First of all, we're going to spawn our enemies. So first we're going to set this enemy dot set position. Now this is going to be cool. I think you can use float x and y, yes. Now I'm going to do it like this so you guys can see it. So the first position is going to be the x position, and we're going to set this to a random value between 0 and the right of the screen somewhere. And to do this, we're going to make a long kind of statement here. So try to follow me on this. This is a nice way to do it. So you want to say this. No, you want to say rand like this between 0 and this window dot get size dot x. So we're randomizing it between 0 and the window size in x, right? And what you're gonna do here, like this, you're gonna put a parentheses around this window get size, and within the parentheses you want to say minus this enemy dot get. You can use get size here actually. In sprites you can't use get size, you need to use get global bounds, but we'll talk about that later. So the reason I'm doing this is because our whole enemy is dependent on that top left corner of the enemy, right? If we set the top left corner at the edge of our screen, the enemy is going to be outside of the screen. So we want the enemy to be as far to the right as possible, minus their own width. So they're kind of in frame. Their top right corner is touching the right side of the screen. That's why we're doing this. Try it without this, try it with half of this, and try it with this to see the difference, okay? So you want to do that. And for this to work, you need to static cast this to an integer. And even, yeah, integer is fine. And then you want to put a comma right there. Now this is gonna complain maybe because it wants a float, but we're gonna take care of that. And you just copy paste that, but put a y here instead. Enemy get size y, window get size y. Okay, that's what you want to do. And then you want to do a static cast float around all of this. Okay, that's what you want to do. Like this. I told you it was going to be a really long one, but yeah, that's how it goes. I might have put something, yeah, one extra comma there. Don't do that. Okay, so let me just explain again. This is a static cast. You should know about this if you learn C++. Basically, it's just turning this whole value into safely turning it into a float. And this random function here only takes something that is an integer. So we have to convert all of this into an integer first and then randomize it. Okay? So that's kind of why it's a little complicated, but it sets the position anyway. This enemy dot set fill color, SF color. So these are uint 8s. You know what? We're gonna take care of that color thing later. Let me just set it to green for now, and then we're gonna say this enemies dot push back this enemy. Okay, and you just spawn the enemy. Boom. All good. All good. Very nice. Okay, now the last thing to do here is removes the enemies at the edge of the screen. So this is something we're gonna have to do. Because we're not gonna be able to do it in this video. It's becoming too long. So what you want to do here is you want to move the enemies. This for loop first. Sorry about that. So first of all, you want to do a for loop. And what you can do is you can do a auto for loop. So auto reference E. You can do whatever you want. This enemies. And then E move. And now the move function works in this way, that it takes a X and a Y scale thing, right? It's not like the scale, but it's kind of a, you can give it a number and it's going to move that entity from the position it is at that frame down with that amount. So if I say 10, it's going to move it 10 frames in any direction I give it each frame. Okay, so what you want to do is you probably want to put this at 5F in the, or 0F in the X direction, because you don't want to move it from side to side. You want to put this at 5F on the Y. All right, so it's going to move all the enemies downwards. Okay, and that's very good. Now if I run this program, hopefully this should work without a hitch, without any errors, because we haven't really done anything special here. It should run. Okay, very nice. It is running. It didn't crash. The only thing we didn't do is render enemies. So you want to copy this for each loop here. Render enemies. But instead of eMove, what you want to do is this window.draw E. So you're rendering all the enemies. Good. And now if we run it, hopefully it will show up on our screen and move downwards. So all the enemies are moving downwards really fast, right? So you can switch this to 1, for example, and it will be a little slower. And it's moving downwards, okay? And each time you run this, they will be at a different direct or position. Now, one thing I noticed before I end, is that you probably don't want the Y to be random. You probably want that at 0.f because, yeah, you want it to spawn at the top like that, okay? And they're just moving downwards slowly. So hopefully you understood everything. Hopefully it wasn't too slow. And in the next video, we're going to remove the enemies as they reach the end. At end of screen, we're going to remove them, and then we're going to click on them and make sure they react when we click on them. And eventually also remove and get some points for them when we click on them to kill them, right? So pretty much that's what we're going to do. And then randomize the speed as well. We're going to do a little more stuff. Just play around with this code. Try to mix it up. Try to find some ways to handle it. And I'm sure you're going to just, fly through it and get really good at this. Remember to comment all the functions I haven't commented. Make sure everything is clear and understandable for you. But there you go, guys and girls. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for sticking with me. Please check out the description box. Also drop a like, subscribe if you like this. And check out my Patreon page. Check out all that stuff. And yeah, most importantly, keep learning, okay? I'll see you guys and girls in the next one. Peace out.